In JavaScript, sometimes people get the concepts of scope and context mixed up. They're definitely not the same thing, so let's see if we can clear it up. Here I have an object I'm creating that will be called foo. It'll be a property of the window object. Now we're using an immediately invoked function expression here so that the window.foo object will be the result of the execution of this function, and there's a reason why we're doing that, and I'll explain that in a second. This function returns an object, and this object will have two properties. It'll have a count property and it'll have a getCount method. Now the reason why we're using an immediately invoked function expression is because we want to have the ability to have a variable that's protected. So this count variable is local to this function. It is not available outside of this function, but it's available to this getCount method. So this getCount method has access to the count property of this object, and it has access to the count variable. Now this variable, this is right here, this is a variable, not a property. It exists in the scope of this function, and it is not available to the outside world. This count is a property. It's a property of the object, and it is available to the outside world, and we can mutate it, which you'll see in a second. When we call the getCount method, it expects an object, type, a string called type. So it's going to return a value here, and it depends on what we get as type. If we get the string scope as the type argument, we're going to increment the count variable. This variable right here, we're just saying count. So count equals this. We're going to increment it and return it. Otherwise, if we don't get the word scope as our type argument, we're going to increment the count property and return it. Now we say this.count because this is where the context comes in. The word this pertains to the object to which a method belongs, and this method, getCount, belongs to this object. So inside this getCount method, this .count equals this count property right here, and the word count just refers to the count variable. So let's create the object, and then if we inspect foo, you'll see that we wind up with an object with two properties: count, which is 100 right up here, and getCount, which is a method right up here. So now when I call the getCount method, it should increment the property of count. Now notice I'm not passing an argument here. So when I don't pass an argument, that means we're going to increment the count property and return it. So since count is 100, we should get 101, and we do. And if I keep going, I could get 102, 103, 104, and that's because the count property was originally 100, and we're by calling getCount without any arguments, it keeps incrementing count. But see, the count property differs from the count variable in that because it's a property of the object, it's available publicly. We can get access to it. So if I were to say foo.count equals 7, then when I inspect foo, you can see that now the count property is 7. And when I call foo.getCount, I get 8 and 9 and 10. So the count property of the object is a property of the object, and it's available publicly. We can see it and we can get to it, but the variable count isn't. So when I call the getCount method and I pass in the word scope, I should get 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and that's because the scope variable was set to 0 and we're incrementing it. And the difference between scope property and scope variable, a big difference, is that we can't get to the scope variable. There's no way we can reach inside this function and get a hold of this variable and increment it manually the way we did with the count property. All we can do is keep calling the getCount method, which will increment it and return it to us. So if I keep calling getCount and passing in the word scope, we're going to keep incrementing the count property, the count variable. But if I call getCount without passing in the word scope, I'm incrementing the scope property. And if I inspect foo, we can see the scope property is now 16. So if I say foo.count equals, let's say, 5,000, and then I say scope foo.getCount, I get 5,001, 5,002, 5,003. So the main thing to keep in mind here is that there's a huge difference between a property and a variable. And here, in this example, we've explored how in a method, we have access to the properties of the object to which that method belongs, and we do that via the this keyword. So this.count equals 100, whereas the count variable is local to this function, unavailable to the outside world, and we differentiate between the two by using count or this.count.